Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest realities hidden beneath the glory of ancient Rome. Because while marble statues and history books love showing us a city of emperors, victories, and shining temples, they rarely show the city that ordinary people actually lived in. They show Rome from a distance, polished and beautiful, like a perfect painting hanging on a wall. But if you could step inside that painting and walk through its streets, smell the air, hear the sounds, and watch the people moving around you, the image would change very quickly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is, because it is always fascinating seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine standing outside Rome around the 1st century as dawn slowly begins to break across the horizon. The first rays of sunlight touch the distant hills and reveal something enormous. Walls stretching across the landscape. Aqueducts cutting across the countryside like giant stone rivers suspended in the air. Massive gates through which thousands of people move every day. From a distance, Rome looks unbelievable. It looks like the greatest city on earth because for many people at the time, it was. Travelers came from distant lands just to see it. Merchants crossed seas to trade there. Soldiers dreamed of marching through its gates. Poets wrote about it. Politicians fought over it. Rome was the center of an empire that stretched across continents. But as you move closer toward the city, something begins changing. The beautiful silence disappears. Instead, you begin hearing sounds. At first they are distant and unclear. Then they grow louder. Wooden wheels grinding against stone roads. Men shouting prices. Animals making noise. Hammers striking metal somewhere in the distance. Children yelling. Merchants arguing. Dogs barking. Suddenly, Rome stops feeling like a peaceful city and starts feeling like a storm made out of people. By sunrise, the roads outside the city gates are already crowded. Farmers arrive carrying vegetables, fruit, grain, and animals for market stalls. Merchants drag carts loaded with pottery and wine. Travelers carrying dusty bags move toward the entrances, hoping to find work or opportunity. Slaves walk beside owners carrying supplies. Soldiers move through the streets in organized groups. Everyone is moving somewhere because Rome never truly waited for anyone. Once you enter through the gates, the scale of the city becomes difficult to understand. Streets stretch in every direction. Buildings rise close together above your head. Crowds push around you from every side. The smell of baking bread mixes with smoke from cooking fires. Somewhere nearby, someone is cooking fish. Somewhere else, someone clearly forgot to remove garbage from yesterday. The air itself feels heavy with life. Rome contained nearly 1 million people, and unlike modern cities, there was very little planning holding everything together. Buildings grew where space existed. Streets twisted around older streets. New structures climbed beside ancient ones. The city expanded like a living thing, trying to fit too much into too little space. And because land inside Rome was valuable, buildings grew upward. Apartment blocks called insula dominated huge sections of the city. Some rose several stories high. Looking upward from narrow streets, you could barely see the sky between rooftops. Laundry hung from windows above. People leaned outward, speaking with neighbors across tiny alleys. Arguments traveled from floor to floor because walls were thin enough that privacy sometimes felt more like a suggestion than a reality. During the morning hours, Rome reached full speed. Markets exploded with activity. Street vendors shouted loudly, trying to attract customers. Fish sellers insisted their fish had arrived fresh that morning. Bread sellers promised their loaves were hotter and softer than anyone else's. Fruit sellers swore their products were sweeter than products from neighboring stalls. Whether any of this was true depended mostly on how convincing the seller sounded. Nearby barbers worked in open shops beside streets. Customers sat while conversations flowed endlessly around them. Politics, rumors, sports, military victories, scandals involving wealthy families. Everyone had opinions about something. News traveled through Rome not through newspapers or broadcasts, but through people talking. And people have always had a talent for improving stories while repeating them. Somewhere a merchant might hear that soldiers defeated a small group of rebels. Several conversations later, the story could become an enormous battle involving thousands of enemies and heroic acts so dramatic they barely sounded human anymore. Rome lived on information, but information often changed shape while moving through crowds. The Forum sat near the heart of the city and represented the center of Roman life. Officially, it was where politics happened, but in reality, it was much more than that. Business agreements happened there. Public speeches happened there. Legal arguments happened there. Citizens gathered there simply to hear news and observe events. If Rome had a beating heart, this was probably it. Men in expensive clothing walked beside workers covered in dust from labor. Wealthy senators crossed paths with ordinary citizens. Priests moved toward temples, while traders carried goods toward markets. Everyone mixed together inside a city so large that every street felt like a world of its own. But beneath all the movement and energy, another reality existed. Not everyone living in Rome experienced power or wealth. Most people lived difficult lives inside crowded apartments where daily survival required constant effort. Water had to be carried upstairs. Food cost money many struggled to earn. Fires could destroy homes. Buildings sometimes collapsed. Crime existed. Disease spread quickly through crowded neighborhoods. Rome looked powerful from a distance, but life inside it could feel uncertain and exhausting. Yet somehow people continued arriving because Rome offered something stronger than comfort. It offered opportunity. Somewhere inside those crowded streets, someone might become rich. Someone might build a business. Someone might join the army and return with rewards. Someone might rise through society in ways impossible elsewhere. Rome frightened people, but it also pulled them toward itself like a giant magnet. And as the sun continued climbing higher into the sky and shadows slowly moved across crowded streets, the city became even louder because the day in Rome had only just begun. The deeper you moved into Rome, the more the city seemed to transform around you, because Rome was not one city in the way people imagine modern cities today. It was hundreds of smaller worlds pressed tightly together inside one enormous space. One street could feel respectable and organized, while the next could feel like chaos had simply been given buildings and allowed to grow freely. As the morning continued and sunlight climbed higher above the rooftops, the streets became almost impossible to ignore. Crowds thickened everywhere. The narrow roads that already seemed crowded at sunrise now felt like rivers overflowing their banks. People pushed past one another carrying baskets, supplies, tools, or simply trying to reach work before someone else took their place. Merchants shouted louder than before because now competition had become serious. Every seller believed his voice deserved to be heard over everyone else's voice. Every shop owner believed his products were better than products sitting only a few feet away. Fish sellers stood beside meat sellers. Bakers stood beside fruit vendors. Pottery merchants sat beside men selling oil lamps and cloth. The sounds mixed together until individual voices disappeared and became one giant noise hanging over the city like invisible weather. Somewhere nearby, metal struck metal as blacksmiths worked beside open shops. Hammers rose and fell repeatedly, sending sparks into the air. Nearby cobblers repaired worn sandals while arguing with customers about prices. Barbers worked quickly, shaving faces while listening to gossip flowing endlessly between clients. In Rome, information moved through conversations almost like water flowing through rivers. People constantly exchanged rumors, stories, and news. Someone claimed an important senator had made a powerful enemy. Someone else swore an army had won a battle in a distant province. Another person insisted grain prices were about to rise. Nobody knew exactly which stories were true and which stories had grown larger while passing from person to person. But certainty was not required. Talking itself was entertainment. The forum had become even busier by midday. Massive crowds filled open spaces between temples and public buildings. Politicians delivered speeches while listeners gathered around them. Some people listened carefully, while others simply enjoyed watching arguments develop. Rome loved arguments. Arguments happened everywhere. Men argued about politics. Merchants argued about money. Customers argued about prices. Neighbors argued about noise. People in Rome sometimes seemed capable of turning almost anything into a disagreement. Nearby legal cases unfolded before public audiences. Citizens gathered around to watch disputes involving property, business agreements, or accusations against individuals. Some people came because they genuinely cared about justice. Others came because watching public arguments was more interesting than returning to work. Entertainment in ancient Rome did not always require theaters or gladiators. Sometimes it simply required two angry people and enough spectators. Meanwhile, the smell of food drifted through the streets. Small stalls sold quick meals to workers and travelers. Bread remained everywhere because bread was central to Roman life. Fresh loaves emerged from ovens throughout the city, carrying warm smells into crowded roads. Nearby cooks prepared sausages, vegetables, olives, and thick stews bubbling slowly over fires. Hungry workers stopped briefly to eat before continuing through their day. But not every smell in Rome made people hungry. The city also carried less pleasant odors. Animals moved constantly through the streets. Horses and donkeys left behind evidence of their existence everywhere they went. Waste sometimes collected beside roads. Garbage disposal systems were far less organized than modern systems. Sometimes people simply threw unwanted things away wherever space existed. During hot days, the smell became stronger. Ancient writers frequently complained about this part of Rome because even people living there recognized that certain sections of the city could become unpleasant very quickly. And above all this activity rose the apartment buildings known as insula. Looking upward from the street, you could see them leaning over narrow roads like giant walls pressing inward. Laundry hung from windows. People leaned outside speaking with neighbors. Children stared down into crowded streets below. Life existed on every floor. Lower apartments belonged to wealthier tenants because they offered easier access and stronger construction. Higher floors usually belonged to poorer residents. Those apartments were smaller and less comfortable. Water often had to be carried upward by hand because plumbing rarely reached the highest levels. Imagine climbing several flights of stairs, carrying heavy buckets every day simply to cook meals or wash clothes. Daily life required effort from morning until night. Yet despite the noise, the smells, and the endless movement, there was energy everywhere. Rome felt alive in a way difficult to describe. Every corner contained movement. Every street contained stories. Every crowd contained thousands of separate lives crossing paths for brief moments before disappearing again into the city. But as afternoon slowly began moving toward evening, another change approached because the Rome people experienced during daylight was not the same Rome they experienced after darkness arrived. As sunlight slowly faded and long shadows stretched across the stone roads, the city prepared to reveal another side of itself, a side that many citizens respected and many others feared. As the afternoon slowly faded and the sunlight began slipping behind the rooftops, Rome started changing in ways that were subtle at first. The endless movement of merchants and workers gradually slowed. Market stalls that had filled the streets all day began disappearing one by one. Wooden tables were folded away, baskets lifted onto carts, and merchants counted coins while keeping suspicious eyes on anyone standing too close. Bakers stacked their remaining bread inside shops. Blacksmiths allowed fires to die down. The constant noise that had covered the city since sunrise started becoming softer, but only for a brief moment because Rome was not becoming quiet. It was simply changing shifts. The city that belonged to workers and merchants during the day was preparing to hand itself over to another crowd entirely. Wealthier citizens finished their business and started returning toward safer districts where larger homes stood behind stronger doors. Servants carried supplies through streets while owners hurried ahead, hoping to reach home before darkness fully arrived. Because even important people in Rome understood something very clearly. Night changed the rules. As the sun finally disappeared and shadows spread through the streets, light itself became a problem. Ancient Rome had no network of street lamps stretching across neighborhoods. Most roads remained dark after sunset, especially inside poorer sections of the city. Light came mostly from windows, small oil lamps, taverns, and people carrying torches as they walked. Between those islands of light stretched long sections of darkness, where buildings leaned close together and narrow alleys became difficult to see. Suddenly, familiar streets felt different. During the day, a narrow alley simply looked crowded. At night, the same alley could feel like the beginning of a bad decision. People walking alone moved faster now. Footsteps echoed differently in darkness. Shadows shifted unexpectedly beside walls. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked. Drunken voices rose from taverns. Laughter mixed with arguments, and arguments occasionally became something louder. Ancient writers often warned people about walking through Rome after dark, because danger did not always announce itself politely. Sometimes thieves waited near dark corners watching, and for travelers carrying money or valuables. Crowded daytime streets had offered protection because witnesses were everywhere. Night removed that protection. In darkness, people disappeared more easily. Pickpockets and criminals understood this perfectly. A traveler unfamiliar with local streets could quickly become a target. A quick shove from behind, confusion for a few seconds, and suddenly, a money pouch hanging from a belt no longer belonged to its original owner. And if someone shouted for help, there was no guarantee help would arrive quickly. Yet crime was not the only thing people worried about, because Rome had another problem falling from above. The apartment buildings surrounding narrow streets had created a strange risk for anyone walking below. Residents on upper floors often looked for simple ways to remove garbage or unwanted waste from homes. Sometimes this involved carrying things downstairs properly. Sometimes it involved opening windows and allowing gravity to handle the situation. Ancient Roman writers complained endlessly about this. Imagine walking through a dark street while also worrying that someone several floors above might suddenly decide it was time for old food scraps, broken pottery, or worse, to leave the apartment. Suddenly looking upward became just as important as looking ahead. One Roman writer joked that anyone walking through Rome at night should prepare a will before leaving home, because danger could arrive from nearly any direction. And while he was exaggerating for humor, there was enough truth hiding beneath the joke to make people uncomfortable. Even wealthy Romans often avoided moving through the city alone after sunset. Important citizens usually traveled with servants or guards carrying torches ahead of them. Not because they wanted to appear important, but because darkness itself had become a problem. Meanwhile, taverns throughout the city had become louder than ever. Wine flowed freely inside crowded rooms filled with workers, travelers, soldiers, gamblers, and people who simply had nowhere else they wanted to be. Music drifted through doorways, dice rolled across tables. Laughter rose suddenly before turning into arguments somewhere nearby. Because when tired people, cheap wine, and long days meet, inside crowded rooms, calm evenings become very difficult to maintain. Rome had not gone to sleep. It had simply changed into another version of itself. And for many people, the most unpredictable part of the city was only beginning to wake up. The fire itself was terrifying, but what made nights in Rome truly dangerous was what happened after the flames died down. Because disasters in ancient cities rarely ended when the immediate danger disappeared. They simply changed shape. By sunrise, entire sections of a neighborhood could look completely different. Buildings that had stood the evening before became black skeletons of charred wood and collapsed stone. Smoke drifted slowly through the streets. Broken pottery, burned furniture, and scattered belongings covered the roads. And somewhere among the debris stood people staring silently at places that only hours earlier had been their homes. Ancient Rome was a city of constant movement, but after a large fire, even Rome slowed down for a moment. Shopkeepers searched through ruins for anything worth saving. Families tried to recover clothing, tools, or coins hidden beneath collapsed walls. Some found possessions, others found nothing at all. Because in many cases, fires moved faster than people could think. You woke up hearing screams outside your window, and within minutes, survival became the only priority. Nobody stopped to collect furniture when smoke was filling the stairways. For poorer Romans living inside crowded insula apartment blocks, this could be devastating. Wealthy citizens often owned multiple properties or country estates where they could temporarily relocate. The poor had no such luxury. If your apartment disappeared in a fire, your entire life disappeared with it. Home, belongings, food supplies, work tools, even savings hidden beneath floorboards or tucked inside walls could vanish overnight. Suddenly, thousands of people had nowhere to sleep. And Rome, despite being the capital of an empire, was not especially famous for gentle social support systems. Some people stayed with relatives. Others slept beneath market awnings or crowded into temples hoping for temporary shelter. Entire groups of displaced residents sometimes wandered through nearby districts, searching for anywhere with enough space to survive another night. Imagine narrow Roman streets, already packed with daily traffic, now suddenly filled with exhausted families, carrying whatever little they managed to save. Children holding baskets, men dragging carts, women carrying blankets or food sacks. Confusion everywhere. Smoke still hanging in the air. The city continuing around them as though nothing unusual had happened.